I think recently there's no event that has caused more tension in the relationship than the situation in Ukraine from 2014 on. And I think we're very fortunate to have Professor Petro here this evening because he was actually in Odessa as a Fulbright Fellow when much of the action brought on by what we call the Maidan demonstrations in Kiev, and then as the repercussions throughout the country from then on, the Russian conducting a referendum in Crimea and then in effect taking Crimea into Russia after that. And Professor Petro was able to see there on the spot in Odessa some of the, I would say, the repercussions internally. And I think that his title is very appropriate, The Tragedy. Now, Professor Petro is, I hate to say uniquely, because undoubtedly there are other scholars who know Ukraine very well, but in a sense, as an American scholar with a deep knowledge of both Ukraine and Russia and direct experience in both, it is really hard to match Professor Petro's knowledge and feeling of what went on there. Professor Petro is a distinguished professor at the University of Rhode Island. He got his degrees, academic degrees from the University of Virginia, and he has his bachelor's degree in history, a master's degree in public administration, and a PhD in international relations. So, and I can't think of a better combination to understand the full pledge. I won't go through his entire biography except to say that that he has had stints working both in academia, at first out at Monterey and the Monterey Institute for International Affairs. He was a Foreign Affairs Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, which allowed him at that time to work in the Office of Soviet Union Affairs, and then to come out to Moscow, actually at a time when I was ambassador, to help with our monitoring of the elections that Gorbachev had initiated. Then subsequently he did research positions, research tours in a number of institutions, the Kennan Institute in Washington, the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and several others. He then actually, around the turn of the millennium, went to Russia sort of as a private citizen and worked in Veliki Novgorod with advising on their development, advising on democratization. He has at least 3 books published, most having to do with the democratization process, and the most recent one about Veliki Novgorod and so on, and the administration. So I think we are very fortunate in having him come and share with us his perception of what is going on in Ukraine. Professor Petro.
Thank you. Well, no, I think I'll stand. I think I'll stand and wave my remarks as a shield for me. So, I'll get started right away, and there will be slides along the way as illustrations of the kind of phenomenon that I'm talking about. I'm going to leave them up as long as possible until I move on to the next slide so you can just think about them. Another point I want to make is, remember my website, which is npetro.net. You just type npetro.net. You would come to my website. Because if any of you would like a copy of the text or a copy of the slides, just email me and I'll be happy to send it to you. A lot of footnotes and things like that, which I obviously can't share with you right now. So one of one's view, I should say, of the crisis in Ukraine depends on one's view of the nature of the conflict. Some see it as a civil war, others as Russian aggression. I view it as a conflict with deep domestic roots in which many external parties are also involved. All these actors, both foreign and domestic, are pursuing their own distinct interests. In the pursuit of these interests, they have discarded the conventions, what the Greeks call the nomos. I'm going to be using some Greek terms because we're going to be talking about why is it a tragedy. The nomos that once sustained the Ukrainian political community and suppressed the dialogue needed for what the Greeks called hezuchia, the peace and tranquility provided by civilization. As a result, the dialogue that is essential for the survival of the community has become an ever more distant memory, a situation that classical Greek authors would recognize as the prelude to the final act of tragedy, nemesis, or the wrath of the gods. I shall return to the implications of what Richard Ned Liebau terms the tragic vision of politics for Ukraine, again at the end of my talk. First, however, I'd like to share with you my view of how we got here and what we should expect to happen over the next 2 years, which corresponds to the next Ukrainian electoral cycle, and whether outside powers can do anything to help. Okay, thank you. Since the demise of the USSR, the two main patterns of political, cultural, linguistic, and religious identity that have coexisted in this region for centuries and that are roughly divided by the Dnieper River have managed a tense coexistence, alternating political power between eastern and western Ukraine in order to prevent the other side from implementing its maximum political and cultural agenda. The resulting political gridlock was thus by design. It was Ukraine's way of avoiding civil war, which many believed would erupt if one side were to gain total political control and turn its vision of Ukrainian identity into a test of civic loyalty. This is what many Ukrainians believe happened on February 22nd, 2014. President Yanukovych's violent ouster from power upset the delicate political balance between Galicia, Galiciana in the west, and Donbass in the east, and was therefore perceived as a direct threat to the core interests of Russophone Ukrainians. 2/3 of Donbass residents surveyed in April of 2014 said they regarded the Maidan as, quote, an armed overthrow of the government organized by the opposition with the assistance of the West, end quote. And as you can see from slide 3, that number has scarcely changed. Both Russia and the West say they want a political and socially stable Ukraine. However, they disagree about how that stability can be achieved. The West, oblivious to the history of Ukraine, assumes that if corruption can be reduced, the economy will grow. A new political consensus will then develop, and cultural divisions will simply fade away. Russia, on the other hand, views Ukraine as a culturally fragmented society. Stability, it says, can be achieved only if political authorities in Kiev accept the bicultural nature of Ukraine and create a constitutional framework that grants the country's major cultural constituencies equal rights. Both sides do agree on one thing, however, at least for now, and that is that the mechanisms for reintegrating the rebel regions of Donbass and forging long-term stability are spelled out in the 13 points of the Second Minsk Accords. Points 1, 2, and 3 of the Minsk Accords deal with separation of forces. The remaining 10 points are what we call political confidence-building measures. Point 5 calls for the pardon and amnesty of those who are engaged in the conflict. The Ukrainian parliament, known as the Rada, did pass an amnesty law, but it only applies to its own soldiers and volunteers. Points 7 and 8 call for restoring economic and financial ties with Kiev and providing humanitarian relief to rebel-held areas. Instead, the Rada has instituted checkpoints, shut down banking and social services to the occupied territories, prevented the payment of pensions and social services there, and suspended railroad transportation, cell phone service, water, and electricity supplies to the region. Point 9 stipulates that control of the border will be transferred to Kiev only after local elections and a comprehensive political settlement. A comprehensive political settlement is defined in point 11 as the adoption of constitutional amendments on decentralization that include a local police force, the right to use the local language, which is Russian, and respect for local religious organizations. In sum, the Minsk Accords treat the crisis as a civil conflict. It commits both Kiev and the rebel regions to a process of reconciliation through direct negotiations aimed at institutionalizing cultural pluralism in Ukraine through changes to the constitution. For the current regime in Kiev, which is committed to total Ukrainianization, this cultural pluralism is its most controversial aspect. Because of this, the Rada set aside discussion of the constitutional changes required by Minsk for the past 3 years. Under strong pressure by Germany, the United States, and France, however, a one-year extension of Minsk, passed as Law 7164, took place last October, just as the Minsk Accords were about to expire. To gain support in Parliament for this unpopular extension, a law on measures to restore state sovereignty, known as Law 7163, was introduced simultaneously. It lays out Ukraine's strategy for regaining control of all temporarily occupied territories. Under the terms of this new law, Ukrainian military operations in eastern Ukraine are no longer to be referred to as an anti-terrorist operation, but rather it is now designated a, quote, military operation with the aim of counteracting Russian aggression, end quote. A special operational staff appointed by the President of Ukraine will now supervise local government, trade, and commerce in the region, as well as all military activities for the region. With the consent of Parliament, the President has also been given the power to introduce martial law anywhere in Ukraine and to restrict the powers of local self-government under martial law. Law 7163 was sent back for revision several times. Nationalists in the Rada insisted that diplomatic ties with Russia must be severed. This was opposed by the government, which pointed out that this would primarily affect the 1 to 2 million migrant workers who are in Russia, Ukrainian migrant workers in Russia, who send back remittances that are vital to the Ukrainian economy. As a compromise, however, all references to the Minsk Accords were removed in Law 7163. The law in its final form is now on the President's desk and is expected to be signed later this month. The law offers nothing new to the residents of rebel-held Donbass. Before, the Ukrainian government refused direct negotiations called for in the Minsk Accords because the rebels were terrorists. Now, because they are puppets of Moscow. Instead of the direct negotiations stipulated by the Minsk Accords, Kyiv says it is willing to consider concessions to the region after it has been reconquered. Since 7163 provides no incentives for rebels to end their fight, a frozen conflict is guaranteed. What 7163 does do, according to Kyiv-based analyst Ruslan Bortnik, is to mitigate damage to Ukraine's image abroad. For example, the law states that Ukraine is not responsible for anything occurring in Donbass. This blunts human rights criticisms of Ukrainian military actions there and is seen by some members of parliament as providing a legal shield against suits by Donbass residents for personal damages, back wages, and unpaid pensions. In addition, Kyiv's interpretation of the Minsk Accords, which places control of the border before local elections rather than after them, as stipulated in point 9, is now made law. As a result, not only is there no roadmap to reintegration, but no roadmap that is based on the Minsk Accords is now legally possible. So far, the reaction of EU governments to 7163 has been limited to disappointment that there is no mention of the Minsk Accords. Officially, however, Kyiv insists that it has always abided and continues to abide by the Minsk Accords, though many Ukrainians do not seem as convinced of this. Within Ukraine today, therefore, there are 3 starkly different approaches on how to resolve this conflict. The nominal opposition, known as the opposition bloc, which is most popular in the eastern and southern regions of Ukraine, takes the view that there will be conflict so long as the government regards a third of the country as potential traitors. Whether justified or not, they say, the rebel cause has broad local support, according to the opposition. Their solution is therefore to begin direct negotiations with the rebels so that Minsk II can be implemented. Ukrainian nationalists and the Party of War, a group that includes the heads of security and military affairs, the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, the former Prime Minister, and the Donbass governors appointed in the region by Kyiv, often disparage Eastern Ukrainians as disloyal and as a potential fifth column. Ukraine, they say, is at war with Russia, and the only solution is a decisive military victory that many also hope will cause the regime in Moscow to topple. After Donbass and Crimea are liberated, they will have to be re-educated into being true Ukrainians, The Minsk Accords are, of course, for the second group, totally unacceptable. The third group includes President Poroshenko and his allies, who argue that the conflict was instigated by Russian efforts to control Ukraine. Since a military solution is not possible, however, the best alternative is to increase Western pressure on Russia until it withdraws entirely from Donbass and Crimea. Then the local people will once again welcome their liberators. Today, the opposition bloc has very little impact, though it still dominates local politics in the 8 predominantly Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine. Ukrainian nationalists have the support of several influential cabinet members and claim to have the National Guard and the Ministry of Internal Affairs on their side. President Poroshenko is caught in the middle. He cannot openly oppose the nationalists for fear of open violence. At the same time, he cannot entirely abandon the Minsk Accords for fear of losing Western support. The result is the paralysis that we have seen these past 3 years. The legislation to be passed this month merely solidifies this paralysis into a frozen conflict, which suits the government and the nationalists just fine, because it removes some 4 to 5 million opposition voters, and that's about 20 to 25% of the total likely to vote, from the rolls. So what should we expect next? Over the course of the next 2 years, as we enter the 2019 election year, the crisis within Ukraine will deepen, since the policies of the government undermine domestic stability. They do so in 3 ways. First, while the Ukrainian economy desperately needs investment, the government is doing everything that it can to prevent its main historical investor, Russia, from putting any money into Ukraine. Meanwhile, no one else is very interested in doing so. I call this suicide economics. Among its most notable expressions are paying more for Russian gas just so that it can pass 100 meters into Slovenia and then be re-imported into Ukraine, thus making it European gas. Paying more for coal from eastern Ukraine so that the government can pretend that it comes from South Africa or Poland. Suspending electronic payment services between Russia and Ukraine, even though remittances from Ukrainians who live and work in Russia during just the first half of 2016 were 5 times the amount Ukraine received from all foreign direct investment. Meanwhile, the caustic effects of IMF borrowing are just beginning to unfold. Ukraine had hoped to use this money, 17.5 billion in pledges, along with the temporary export preferences it obtained through the EU partnership agreement, to attract foreign investment. Alas, the 1.5 billion it was able to attract in 2017 vanishes into insignificance compared to the 100 billion it has lost in trade with Russia since 2012. As a result of a critical shortage of cash and investment, IMF funds are being used to cover current government expenses, resulting in an ever-expanding spiral of government debt. In 2017, Ukraine already paid back to the IMF more than it received from the Monetary Fund. This situation will only get worse, with Ukraine having to borrow money at commercial rates to pay off its foreign debt. Over the next 5 years, in what can only be termed a form of fiscal waterboarding, Ukraine will have to pay $28.7 billion to its foreign debt holders, not including Russia, more than half of that to the IMF. As I said, this does not include the $5 billion it must pay to Russia imminently because of the recent decisions of the London court and the Stockholm arbitration decision, and for which it is paying right now $1.2 million in fines for every day that it delays payments on that amount. Predictably, this has led to mass poverty. Minimum pensions, which 80% of Ukrainian retirees receive, has fallen from $112 per month in 2013 to $49 per month last year, in December. Average monthly wages, which had been over $400 in 2013, fell to just $261 at the end of 2017. 58% of Ukrainians now say they spend more than half their income on utilities and housing-related services. Second, at a time when the government should be focused on reducing domestic tensions, reknitting the country together, it is promoting unpopular local name changes, controversial Western Ukrainian historical figures, and suppressing the use of the Russian language. According to a poll commissioned by the party Successful Ukraine in January, so last month, 61% nationwide said they opposed further decommunization and wanted to see the former place names restored. In the eastern and southern regions of Ukraine, similar surveys typically yield results of 75 to 80%. In addition to banning all Russian films made after 2014, government agencies have compiled long lists of Russian TV series actors, singers, artists, writers, journalists who are now prohibited from entering the country. Last summer, you'll recall the government blocked the country's most popular social media sites because they were in Russia, and temporarily banned all books from Russia that are not for personal use. The new book licensing procedures now in place has cut the number of Russian books allowed into Ukraine by 90%, resulting in a thriving black market. New laws now mandate minimum percentage of Ukrainian language content in all local media and public advertisement, regardless of local language usage. This in a country where Russian is overwhelmingly preferred in at least a third of the country and in almost every major city. Finally, I expect the current crisis will get worse because of ever-expanding corruption. A report issued last month in the Ukrainian daily Vesti noted that 37 billion hryvnia, $1.3 billion, have been collected for the benefit of the Ukrainian military through specific taxes on social services, called военный сбор. Collection for the military. Unfortunately, no one has any idea where this money went, or even if any of it was used to support the military. This follows earlier research done separately by Amnesty International, on the one hand, and the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, the group that broke the Panama Papers story, that Ukrainian arms dealers have become one of the main intermediaries for Eastern European weaponry making its way to conflict zones in Africa. Some say that the current conflict with Russia has become too profitable for the current Ukrainian elites to give up. They point out that the first declarations of assets by public officials in 2016 revealed that on average, members of parliament in Ukraine had amassed roughly $670,000 in cash and $220,000 in banks, nearly as much as the average US member of Congress. Meanwhile, the average Ukrainian had just $260 in cash and $380 in the bank, a ratio of over 1,000 to 1. Interestingly, while the regions of Ukraine disagree about many things, the fact that the war goes on because it is a source of profit for the ruling elite is something on which there is broad disagreement. There's broad agreement, I should say, across the entire country. Italian analysts have likened the situation in Ukraine to classical Italian gattopardismo, a phenomenon described by author Giuseppe Tommasi di Lampedusa, where Sicilian elites pretend to, quote, change their spots for their northern patrons, while actually working assiduously to ensure that everything remains the same. Not surprisingly, this state of affairs has shattered public confidence in the political leadership. The current precarious balance of rent-seeking elites has effectively prevented any strategy for reconciliation from emerging within Ukraine. Hopes for a resolution of the conflict have therefore increasingly come to rest on the intervention of foreign actors. I, however, have serious doubts about the international community being able to break through the current impasse due to parochial and conflicting interests. The European Union's long-term scenario, even under the Eastern Partnership Agreement, was to have Russia, not the EU, absorb Ukraine's migrant labor force and continue to serve as its primary economic investor. This was confirmed by the amendments to the EU Association Agreement adopted, you'll recall, at the insistence of the Netherlands, on December 16, 2016, which explicitly stated that there is no obligation to grant EU membership to Ukraine, there is no obligation to provide collective security or any military support to Ukraine, Ukrainian citizens have no right to live and work in the EU, and there is no obligation by the EU to provide any financial support to Ukraine. The United States, for its part, seems to be once again in what Ambassador Steve Pfeiffer once called full Ukraine fatigue mode. While the current administration cannot, for domestic political reasons, refuse to support Ukraine, this support is largely rhetorical. That leaves Russia, which for obvious geopolitical, economic, religious, and cultural reasons has the strongest interest in encouraging a settlement in Ukraine. Its vision of how to resolve the conflict, expressed in the Minsk Accords, are however rejected by the current regime in Kiev. Progress toward peace has been stymied because the three external parties, the EU, the USA, and Russia, have been unable to forge a common vision of Ukraine's future. The best chance of achieving such a common vision, given the fundamental lack of trust among them, would be to recognize that failure to work together is likely to lead to much worse outcomes than the present frozen conflict. These include a coup, resulting in the rise of extreme nativists to power, who would espouse anti-Western as well as anti-Russian sentiment. We would do well to bear in mind that for Ukrainian nationalists, joining the EU was never an end goal. It was the lesser of two evils, the worse evil being continued dependence on Russia. They would happily give up the dream of a Ukraine in the EU for what they term, quote, the new Ukrainian order, end quote, a code phrase for a Ukraine that is racially and culturally pure and therefore able to pursue its own ideal of integral nationalism. Russia and the West would therefore seem to have a common interest in avoiding such an outcome by A, offering incentives to their respective clients to work toward a resolution of the conflict, B, publicly condemning the military rhetoric that is coming from the party of war, the so-called much-touted Croatian solution, and C, publicly condemning the effort to build a Ukrainian identity exclusively around Galicia and calling instead for an inclusive Ukrainian civic identity. Finally, although domestic political interests in the West do not allow politicians to say so, it is important to affirm publicly that Ukraine cannot prosper without close ties to Russia. The reason for this should be obvious. No country in history has ever prospered by making itself the enemy of a wealthier and more powerful neighbor. The current crisis will therefore only begin to dissipate when this inescapable reality is acknowledged. The recent Stockholm arbitration decision that compels Ukraine to buy no less than 4 billion cubic meters of gas from Russia through the end of its contract in 2019 may be taken as a sign that Europeans recognize this. I entitled my talk, "The Tragedy of Ukraine." Let me explain why. And to remind you of one thing, if you forget everything else, remember this. Tragedy is therapy. As classically understood, a tragedy is not merely a sad situation. It is a very specific set of conditions that come about through the character flaws that lead actors inexorably to catastrophe. Tragedies warn us about the danger of acting outside the bounds of tradition and community, and offer a constant reminder about the importance of sustaining the conventions, nomos. According to Thucydides, when Athens launched the Peloponnesian War to enhance its hegemony over Hellas, it became deaf to justice. Tragic heroes like Pericles missed the mark and made disastrous choices seduced by the prospect of quick victory. This resulted in catastrophe and nemesis, the wrath of the gods, for throwing away the gifts of reverence for custom and justice that enabled people to live together in harmony. I believe there are at least 3 reasons to view Ukraine's courageous revolutionaries, hell-bent on righting the wrongs that were done to them and to their ancestors, as tragic figures ensnared by the arrogance commonly associated with greatness, which the Greeks called hubris. The first reason is that although everyone wants what is best for Ukraine, their efforts are at cross purposes. Rather than leading to a search for compromise, however, this has led them to harden their resolve, threatening the very existence of the state they are trying to save. This slide is an interesting one because it asks in sequence 2 interesting questions. Would you be willing to compromise if it would lead to peace? Yes, they have. What compromises would you support? None. So in principle, yes, but when it comes down to deciding what to do, we can't agree. And as I was looking at the list that they were providing to people as to what the sort of compromises they might be willing to agree to, 1, 2, 3, 4 of these are in fact requirements of the Minsk Accords. Another reason is willful ignorance of the cost associated with imposing what was touted at the time as a new civilizational choice. The visa-free regime with the EU that the new government made the standard for its success is a good case in point. While it is helping Ukraine's neighbors resolve their demographic and skilled labor shortages, Ukraine itself is losing the young population it needs to provide sufficient revenues for the modernization of social programs, utilities, and pensions. As economist Dmitry Jangirov has aptly remarked, the project to integrate Ukraine the nation into the EU turns out to be the project to integrate selected Ukrainians into the EU. Finally, in a manner that is all too typical of classical tragedies, the solution to Ukraine's problems seem as blindingly obvious as they are remote. Strengthen the bonds of communal identity through dialogue. Translated into the present, this would mean embracing the nomos of all Ukrainian history rather than just the last century, and seeking reconciliation with Ukraine's own Russophone citizens, thereby encouraging reconciliation with Russia itself. If there is a glimmer of hope at the end of this dark tunnel that Ukraine has found itself in, therefore, it is this: convincing Russia of the need to join in the process of creating a viable Ukrainian state, because Europe and the United States have shown that they cannot do it on their own. Why would Russia want to join such an effort? The most obvious reasons are these: to end the Ukrainian refugee crisis, which in 2014 and 2015 rivaled in size the exodus of migrants from the Middle East into all of Europe. To benefit economically by restoring trade with Ukraine, with the objective ultimately of enticing Ukraine into the Eurasian Economic Union, and through it into what I call the greater Chinese co-prosperity sphere, which is now going around Ukraine. And finally, for Russia to enhance Russia's security by encouraging a neutral Ukraine. None of these are fundamental obstacles for most Europeans, where it has become common for statesmen to change from being proponents to opponents of sanctions on Russia as soon as they leave office. Here's a little list of people. This is a year old, so some of the names have changed. Some have been added. There are now more people in the middle group than on the left. It is much more difficult, however, to imagine the United States supporting such a joint effort. The only reason I can imagine it might do so is if American officials became convinced that sanctions are a serious source of friction with our European allies, and if they concluded that on its present course, the disintegration of Ukraine is inevitable. I see no evidence of such a recognition. But even if a miraculous transformation were to occur and the West suddenly decided that it needs Russian help to save Ukraine, Russia's acquiescence to any partnership with the West and Ukraine will not come cheaply. That is because it perceives U.S. strategy there as based on a fundamentally flawed premise, namely that Russia's economy will buckle before Ukraine's economy will. Russia, meanwhile, is convinced of the exact opposite. Moreover, as Putin has often intimated, economics, history, geography, language, and religion all condemn Ukraine and Russia to close relations, if not to friendship. They have therefore concluded that time is on Russia's side if nothing else happens. I suspect the next Ukrainian elections in 2019 will tell us if this is true. Thank you very much.